Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today I'm joined once more by Sandre the teacher. He's become a regular on here by this point, and he's always very lively. We talk about postmodernism, Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, whether or not sociology is a science, and much more. We intended to talk about string theory, but we hit the 2-hour mark before realizing we haven't talked about it yet, so expect a 4th episode with him for that. The links to his channel and Twitter are in the description of the video below. Feel free to also join the Discord server for the Babylon project as well. Anyways, hope you enjoy this episode.
Shut up and sit down.
All right, so I'm here speaking again with Sandre. Hey man, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Got a lot of projects up in the air as usual, but I guess that's pretty much what you can say. It's pretty much the usual. Nothing really unusual in that sense. Just trying to balance studies, work, as well as keeping my YouTube channel alive. So. But it's good otherwise. You?
Yeah, I'm hanging in there. Again, just started school, as I was mentioning before we started the podcast, and I'll see how well my time management skills are going to be. I'm going to do my best to try to make it much more productive this time than it was last time, but we'll see how successful I am, or how unsuccessful I probably will be. But it's good to have you back on. This is the 3rd time that you're on here. I think you are officially tied in first place with the number of recurring guests. So congratulations, you get the honorary Babylon Award for that.
Well, I mean, it's good to know that I'm appreciated and wanted on this podcast. I have to say, like, so far it's been a great place to sort of vent. I'm going to do some more venting today, but we'll also have, like, I think some very productive discussions because we're going to talk a bit about the problem of wokeness entering science, as well as the even older problem of postmodernism, trying to sort of chip away at science, as well as actually some corruption of science from within science itself, like with modern theoretical physics. And it's interesting because, like, you're actually a physics student, so it's going to be interesting to talk to you about this. But yeah, so I was thinking that we could maybe just go back a little bit to the beginning of, like, even before wokeness, and then we'll get into that later on, but talk a little bit about like when it actually became sort of trendy, if you will, in the other academic fields to sort of try and chip away at the image of science. So let's start with postmodernism, because there's a lot of valid critique against postmodernism. But the problem is, usually the people, what I've noticed at least, is that a lot of the people who are the most vocal about arguing against postmodernism and are, I would say, correct in attacking postmodernism, a lot of them sadly don't even seem to understand what postmodernism actually is. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, like, I actually did a series of videos debunking Jordan Peterson, and one of the videos was where in one of the videos I pretty much showed that he doesn't really understand, it seems, what postmodernism actually is. Like, he conflates postmodernism with Marxism, and that's a bit of a fatal flaw, because Marxists and postmodernists, they don't tend to like each other. Right. And honestly, you will have the occasional idiot who will say that, oh, I'm both a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I mean, that's no different from, like, a person saying that, oh, well, I'm a Nazi and a Stalinist at the same time. Like, you have those idiots too. Like, there's not a lot of them, but you have some of those idiots too, and they don't realize that it's inherently contradictory. Like, it's an oxymoron, And one of the reasons why postmodernism is not the same thing as Marxism is because, well, Marxism believes in a grand narrative. Marxists believe that you can predict the future by looking to the past. Postmodernists sort of reject all of that, you know. Now, there are similarities between them, of course, and Jordan does correctly point out some of the similarities. Like they both offer a bit of what's the word? An underdog story, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's just Marxism deals with class primarily, and postmodernists don't necessarily deal with economic class, but rather talk about other intrinsic attributes of people, you know, such as your skin color and gender and whatnot. So if you want to say that they're similar in how they portray struggle of certain demographics, I mean, sure, you can do that. But I mean, Nazis portrayed a struggle of white people versus Jews, let's say, and yet they were at war with, you know, the Soviet Union, which did the same, but regarding economic class. And why is that? Well, because they're not the same. You know, basically what Jordan is doing, he's committing the composition fallacy. You know what I mean? Like he looks at one thing that they have in common and then asserts that, oh, well, I mean, it must all be the same. Well, no, that's not how it works, you know, because like even the most polar opposites of ideas on a spectrum, they need to have something in common, like at least one thing to even be on the same spectrum. You know, that's just how it is. And so the problem I find is that, like, not only is there a problem with postmodernists themselves, but another problem is that a lot of the people who say that they want to, you know, fight against postmodernism don't really seem to understand what it is, like I said. And they conflate it with Marxists, and that's not something you should do. Again, there are some similarities, but they are just not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to sort of separate the two. And if you want to fight against Marxists trying to, you know, corrupt science, you know, I find that amicable, and I support you there. Just don't confuse that fight with postmodernists, because postmodernists are masters when it comes to sort of being slippery, if you know what I mean. Like they know how to be slippery. They know how to evade criticism. So all they have to do when you do that is to say, well, I'm not a Marxist, and I mean, what are you going to do? You know,
Yeah.
so everything you've done has been in vain, pretty much. So you need to go straight to the source and attack the source. But you know, the problem with postmodernism is that it offers a framework where you sort of can be critical of systems. And ironically, the biggest problem with postmodernism is that it's too good at it. You know what I mean? Like you've probably heard or read about, you know, critical race theory, for instance, you know. And the problem with critical race theory is that the framework that it provides, it works too well. You know, basically what postmodernists are really good at is that they're offering a set of questions to ask that are sort of loaded in a way that lead you down to a logical conclusion that may or may not be true. And the problem is, since these questions are loaded and sort of predetermined in a way to lead to a set of conclusions, this may give the illusion that you've, you know, enacted the labor, so to speak, and you've critically asserted or ascertained a logical basis of your newfound conclusion. But the problem is, you've really just deluded yourself into thinking that you're being rational, but there's no rationality to be found. You've essentially just manipulated yourself into believing something that you would not believe had it not been for these presuppositions and this, you know, what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? Basically, you're not employing something like the Socratic method, where the outcome is not determined, but you're essentially just asking questions that are loaded that leads you down a red thread that's already spun for you. You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to find the word here. Like we like I told you in the DMs, I'm a little bit tired now in the morning, so I hope the audience understands what I mean at least. But the point is, the problem with postmodernism is that if postmodernism is all you know, and you have not studied other ways of thinking, you know, then you might believe that you really have attained a methodology that gives you clear answers about questions of, life and whatever. But unless you have a reference frame, such as, unless you've taken basic lessons in logical thinking, let's say, or you've perhaps studied some, math, or you've read anything about a natural science. If you haven't done those things, and postmodernism is really all you know, then you will have what is essentially a Dunning-Kruger effect, where you will believe that you have greater knowledge about the methodologies of other fields than you actually do. So yeah, I was thinking that we would start talking a little bit about how that sort of assault on modern science started. And I think we can start a little bit with Kuhn,
Okay.
because some people would perhaps argue that he wasn't like a postmodernist, and I can see some of those points. But whether he was a postmodernist himself or not, there is no denying that postmodernists rely a lot on Kuhn, so to speak. Because when Kuhn released his book, God, I can't remember what it's called now. What was it called?
The structure of scientific revolutions.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, like I said, folks, it's early in the morning for me, so I've tried to have some caffeine, but yeah, it takes a while. So anyway, when he released his book, academics in the humanities, they pretty much celebrated, and they thought it was like the best thing since sliced bread. And I can see why. I've read his book. I even did a video essay on it. And I talked about how I think he's actually perfectly valid when it comes to some of his observations. I think Kuhn is absolutely correct when he says that, you can have sort of paradigm shifts in science. And, I do believe that you have these waves in science where you have big breakthroughs, and then you have periods where, it goes a little bit slower, and eventually you sort of start to, you start to sort of use up a little bit of the steam that you had originally, and eventually you reach sort of a dead end because the old framework, the old paradigm, just isn't sufficient anymore at explaining certain phenomena in science. I think he's absolutely correct when he talks about this. The problem I have, however, with Kuhn is that I think what he's actually identifying is the psychology of scientists and the public regarding science. I don't think he's identifying anything about scientific procedure itself, because we have a certain procedure when it comes to, a chemistry lab. Now, tell me, does my volumetric flask care an iota about what I think about covalent bonds, let's say?
I'd like to say no, but who knows?
Exactly. Or, when I measure MRI, does the spin of the proton, does it give a damn about what I think regarding the length of a butane molecule?
I mean, as far as we're concerned, no.
Exactly. See, the thing about Kuhn is that he's not actually identifying anything regarding the procedure of science itself, because the procedure of science is designed to be, as literally like the dependence on the researchers is supposed to be more or less non-existent. We've already gotten to a point now where we can get some pretty objective answers, And that's because we've learned over hundreds of years to reduce the intuition of the scientist in the procedure as much as possible, you know? Like you could have made that argument early on in modern science when proto-science sort of became modern science. So we're talking around the age of like Newton and Dalton, let's say. That's really when I would say that you start to have like what we call modern science. So we're talking like, you know, somewhere between the 1600s to the 1700s. That's really when modern science started, I would say. But so in the early phases there, like you could definitely make the argument that intuition played a big role regarding the procedures of science and how we formed ideas about things. But ever since then, like we've evolved, and Kuhn doesn't seem to want to either. He doesn't want to recognize that, or he doesn't realize it, because he in his book he's writing about it as though we are still, you know, standing around with physical weights, and you know, basically like Galileo, like dropping, you know, differently sized stones from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to see if the bigger stone that has more mass, if it's going to fall faster than the lighter one. That's not what's going on anymore. Like we have very precise ways of measuring things. We can literally measure things down to, you know, like quarks if you have enough energy. So we are not at that stage anymore. And you know, I don't I don't understand how you can miss that. Even when Kuhn wrote his book, even then computer power was sufficient where, I mean, don't get me wrong, you needed a big fucking room to have a computer that could do it, but even then you had enough computing power where you could have like objective calculations of certain things, you know. That's, for instance, how like you got to the moon in 1969. So Kuhn, he either doesn't realize in his book, or he doesn't recognize that, you know, it's been slow, sure, but over time we've gotten less and less and less and less dependent on the thinking of the scientist, and more focused on being as objective as possible during measurements, you know, and experimentation. You know, that's like, for instance, James Watson, who was one of the two who really is credited with, you know, discovering the structure of the DNA helix. I think it's James Watson. That's the one who basically he's a bit of a race realist. If I don't know if you know this, but and he had this lecture that became infamous. I think it was back in 2009, maybe, where he started talking about how like people with high levels of melanin in their skin, how they were more promiscuous and whatever. Yeah, it was really bad, and eventually they sort of had to let him go because he was making all kinds of unscientific statements. And it wasn't because of his opinions that he was fired. Like they already knew at that point that like he had like some race realist beliefs and whatever. So they could have fired him much sooner if that was what they were worried about. But no, they fired him because he was breaking the conduct of, you know, making assertive statements without any evidence to back it up, you know. And even if you just do it in a press conference, like that's bad, because that's not what science is about. But James Watson's opinions on the DNA of certain demographics has no bearing whatsoever on the measurements we make of those actual demographics. You know what I mean? Like we've mapped the human genome. And according to Kuhn, just because you still had, you know, let's say some, you know, geneticists who have like some relic beliefs regarding, you know, classifications of human beings, you would see that they would get like results that would be vastly different from the measurements of the genome that other geneticists make that, you know, don't have these beliefs. But that's not what we see. You know, James Watson, when he does an experiment, he's going to get the same result as someone who doesn't share his beliefs. Why? Well, because the methodologies we use are objective, more or less. You know,
Yeah.
now you can interpret the results. That's different. You can interpret them in a certain way. But I mean, if postmodernists really want to open that can of worms, I mean, they're gonna get destroyed, because that's all they do.
Yeah.
You know. So I mean, so my point is this: Kuhn is excellent, I think, if you want to understand the psychology of the actual scientists, as well as how the scientific community deal with groundbreaking discoveries and sort of adapt to new frameworks of ideas, and how to adapt methodologies based on their findings. That is a social process, just like it is like an actual mechanical process. However, he just doesn't understand it. He even gets some things wrong, like objectively, uh, when he writes about the actual procedures of science itself.
Hmm.
Um, Again, we have methodologies today that more or less completely make the opinion of the scientist irrelevant. You know, I mix lithium, with water, it's going to go bang. I can
Yeah.
disagree with basic ideas regarding the position of the electron in the orbitals of the lithium atoms. I can do that, but that doesn't change the fact that, well, we see a reaction when we mix lithium with water. So obviously my opinions have to be wrong.
Hmm.
My opinions do not change reality, and we've ascertained methodologies these days that remove the opinions of the scientist.
Yeah.
So, and not only that, but like, letting your opinions, letting that cloud your your experimental procedures, so that you can sort of fudge things in a way where you get the results you want. That is highly frowned upon in modern science. In fact, to such a degree where, you know, even doing that just once can lead to you losing your status completely. You may get barred from even publishing anything anymore, and that is grounds for universities to fire you on the spot and whatever. So yeah, Kuhn just doesn't. Kuhn is simply just wrong when it comes to these things. You know what I mean? And I know that you also talked a little bit about Kuhn in some of your previous podcasts. Maybe you want to go into that.
Oh, yeah. So there's two main problems that I have with Kuhn. One is his misunderstanding of science. So when he talks about normal science, he says that he's under the impression that it's not until after a paradigm shift occurs in which we have to completely reevaluate all of the mechanisms that we've put in place to understand how reality works, that then we just work on the assumptions of those mechanisms. And that's not entirely true, because implied there is that we basically stop searching for something that will completely revolutionize our understanding of what we know then. But that's not what scientists do. Scientists consistently try to prove what they believe to be true wrong. And, and he gets like these little things incorrect. And again, Kuhn wasn't a scientist. He was a sociologist. I think he was a professor of history at Berkeley, a professor of the history of science at Berkeley. So he wasn't a scientist. And even though he's probably read what the scientific method was, he never actually put it into practice, it seems. So that's one of my main issues with Kuhn. The second issue that I have is that his thesis is borderline unfalsifiable, and if that's the case, how much should we care about it? So in the same way that you can make a mathematically strong argument that we live in a simulation, or that Stephen Hawking was on point when he gave his whole fishbowl hypothesis, and the TLDR is that you can have a really intelligent fish inside of a curved bowl, and it can write down all the equations that it sees for things that are outside of that bowl. But because this fish views everything in a parabolic arc, then his equations are going to be much more complicated and contingent on that curvature. And so, but nevertheless, he could still make accurate predictions using equations. And if that's the case, but the fish would never know that it's viewing everything through a curved manner. What's to say that something similar isn't undergoing us? And so, sure, these are interesting philosophical questions, but we recognize that because they're unfalsifiable, as far as we're concerned, we don't really care that much about it within the context of science. And if Kuhn is correct, then it's kind of the same thing. Then, okay, yeah, things go in paradigm shift. And there's no way in which we're going to be able to officially say, okay, this is the final paradigm shift. We now officially have a grasp on reality. If we can't do that, then like, okay, so then why are we really caring about this that much? Yeah, simulation theory is interesting. You could say it's mathematically compelling, but we can't prove it yet. So why do we care that much about it right now?
We're getting to that as well when it comes to some of the cancer that we have in modern theoretical physics. It's one of those things that really irks me. But the thing is, so yeah, I think you're pretty much spot on. And the biggest problem with Kuhn is that I think he's spot on. I really do when it comes to describing, just people in general who deal with science. If you want to say that scientists, because scientists are human beings. Scientists strive to be as rational as possible, but fundamentally you can't be 100% rational. Like not even a highly trained scientist can be. But that is why Kuhn, that is why we today rely on procedures and oversights that are supposed to eliminate that personal bias, if any exist. Or that's why we get independent teams and whatever to try and sort of either disprove or confirm certain things that we find, whatever. So we have literal infrastructures in science today to reduce as much as possible the influence of opinions of scientists. And the same thing goes as well when it comes to scientific consensus. Like this is very important. You shouldn't believe that climate change is real because 97% of scientists believe it is. Okay, so when these climate denialists when they make that argument, they're not wrong. You're absolutely correct. But I've never said that's why you should believe it. Here's the thing, though. If 97% of scientists believe in climate change and that it's caused by human activity, that is, however, a good indication that there's a lot of evidence for it. And that should tell you that you should look at the evidence. And yeah, the evidence is overwhelming. We have many examples in modern science where you've had a certain consensus, maybe even a strong consensus in scientific communities. But as soon as the evidence rolls in that this is wrong, well, guess what? No problem. Within a decade, like the consensus changes because the evidence is first and foremost. We don't live in the age anymore where, you have more leeway and where you have more discussion between scientists, like, again, like the early days of modern science, like, Galileo and Newton and Dalton. There, since we just didn't have, advanced enough technologies yet to like have more objective ways of measuring things, there was a bit more leeway, to have these types of discussions. And there you sort of had to rely a bit more on intuition, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But like, again, over time, our techniques have been more refined. We've set up committees and oversights to look over the process, to basically checks and balances, and definitely since the 1930s, when peer review became like an official thing that was standardized. You can't tell me since the like any credibility regarding how he describes scientific procedure, that died definitively in 1930 or in the 1930s, I would say. So again, Kuhn, had he lived during the time of Galileo and Newton and Dalton or whatever, like he would have had sort of he would have had more of a point, if you know what I mean. Like, yeah, he would be more on spot, like still not entirely correct, of course, but at least he would have more of an argument, I would say, because yeah, back then it was sort of the intermediary period of science where it was still a bit murky, like what is actually science here, what is still proto-science. And again, if he wants to talk about like the period of proto-science, which is like all the way up until before Galileo, I would say, then yeah, he would be very much correct, I think, far more so than he would be today. But today, no, I'm sorry, Kuhn is simply just wrong when he describes it. I know Kuhn also mentions another argument. If I'm not mistaken, I think he makes this he takes the example of relativity, I believe. And he talks about how relativity was a bit of a paradigm shift in science or whatever. And it was. But he incorrectly, if I remember correctly here, he incorrectly sort of states that relativity was sort of seen as, it became sort of the centralized and accepted dogma with Einstein in the early 1900s. And I mean, sure, don't get me wrong, Einstein became very influential in physics very early on in the 1900s. Like, he didn't really have to wait that long to be, influential and recognized for his brilliance. Like, he's one of those scientists that sort of gets lucky in kind of early on in his career, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So he didn't have to wait like several decades like many others before him, before he was sort of discovered and his ideas were sort of recognized as, yeah, there's definitely something here. But what Kuhn doesn't mention, again, if I'm remembering what he wrote correctly, he doesn't mention that relativity was not seen as officially, a fully implemented theory until we actually confirmed the observations that Einstein predicted. And it wasn't until we literally sent a satellite into space to measure if we did see a difference between the ticks of the clock, if you will, between Earth and the satellite. So if I remember correctly, it's not until we actually did that we said, okay, well, now we know, we can definitely say that this is like a proper theory at this point. So the theory of relativity, it's now actually a theory because we now have the technology to properly test what Einstein predicted. I believe that up until the 1960s, the theory of relativity was really just a very strong hypothesis up until that point, but it wasn't actually classified as a theory until the 1960s. I could be wrong, but I believe that that's like when you could actually test this more rigorously and more exactly. Because up until that point, like the strongest evidence you had for relativity was basically what you could derive from Maxwell's equations regarding the speed of light and whatnot, as well as the works of Einstein regarding general and special relativity. And the math definitely checked out, and that's why it was sort of entertained very early on in physics. But it wasn't until they could actually test it that they said, okay, now this is officially a theory. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Kuhn doesn't mention that, I don't believe, and that's a huge oversight on his part, because up until that point, relativity was definitely a very strong hypothesis, but it wasn't actually seen as a theory, I don't think, until the 1960s. But yeah, so that's really one of the good starting points, I think, when you want to understand how postmodernists, like how they sort of attack science, because very few of them, either because they're incompetent or because they're dishonest, but a lot of them don't actually attack science head on, but they sort of try to attack the character of the scientists, you know what I mean? And they sort of try to sort of question the motives of scientists rather than the modus operandi of science. And I think that's quite telling because, well, let me put it this way. A good way to sort of tell if someone's full of shit when it comes to like political commentary, a good way to sort of tell if they're full of shit or not is, okay, analyze what they're saying. If they usually go for the character of the politician instead of the actual policies that they pursue, then that tells you that this is someone who's doing a very surface level analysis and is engaging in all kinds of logical fallacies to sort of ascertain some kind of predictive model of the future if this person was in power or if this person is in power. But what you really should do is, I'm not saying that by the way, I'm not saying that the character of the politician doesn't matter. I mean, of course, corruption and whatever does matter. But what I'm also saying is, you can't just look at that. You also have to look at the actual policies, being suggested. And you can call Bernie Sanders, for instance, a commie if you want, but that doesn't change the fact that he has actually stood up for the free speech of people that he doesn't believe in, like Ann Coulter. It doesn't change the fact that all the reforms that he's suggested to implement, it's what you find in mixed economies around the world. Bernie Sanders, when you look at his actual policies as well as his conduct as a politician, he's not a commie. So anyone who calls Bernie Sanders a commie, well, you can definitely tell that they're full of shit.
And very quickly, I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but another thing that we really need to recognize, and everything that you're saying is 100% true, and I think part of the reason that's true is also because we have to recognize that when we're looking at the policy, whether or not it's a good policy or a bad policy, well, we're basically using deductive knowledge to come to a conclusion of whether or not that policy is good, in our opinion, right? But when we're trying to think about the motives of the person behind it, we're using inductive knowledge, and we have to be very, very careful when we use inductive knowledge. And I think that's one of my huge problems with postmodernism, is that inductive knowledge is valuable, it's useful, we need it, but they go way overboard with it to the point where they use inductive knowledge as if it was deductive, and it's just not the case.
Yeah, and you can sort of see that a little bit in sort of the mindset that you have today in many academics, sadly, in the so-called social scientists, that they seem to have this idea that the accusation is the evidence. Like, for instance, if you take, for instance, how the campus reacted, I can't. What was it? Duke University. You remember the famous case where you had these lacrosse players who were accused of rape.
Oh,
Yeah, and it turned out that the story was complete bogus, and this woman had actually been known to make false accusations regarding rape and whatever. And even her family didn't believe her and told media that, yeah, we don't buy this. She does this, like she has a history. Don't believe her. And the police did their investigation. There just wasn't any evidence that they were guilty, and yet these teachers on this campus, and especially the so-called social scientists of this campus, they were the first ones who said, "Oh, these boys, they need to be expelled. They need to confess, blah blah blah." And basically, we just let the students get away with like harassing these poor students. And I think that's sort of a symptom of something larger. Now that's a social phenomena, of course, in this case, and we'll try and bring it back now to the actual science here. But the point is, I think that is like one of the symptoms of the problematique, if you will, that you have in so-called social science, because this may be controversial to some people, but social science is not science. It's just not. Look, let me put it this way: sociology is really, really important. I'm actually not one of these people who say that, oh, sociology is useless, it has no place in society, it's just a waste of time, blah 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 blah. No, I think people who say that are just as ignorant as a lot of these social scientists who try to attack actual science. But no, sociology is really important. It really is. Okay. However, it's not a science. I think there's so again, I don't really agree with this conclusion, and I can't remember who made this statement, but there's one thinker, can't remember his name now, but he basically described it as physics envy, where basically he thought that some social scientists seem to be sort of envious of natural science, because natural science, due to its rigor and robustness and independence from personal biases in its methodologies, come up with results that are that supersede any result that a social scientist comes up with. And because of the sheer grade of evidence is just so much higher, the quality of evidence is just so much higher. And he described it as sort of physics envy, and basically where you have these social scientists, these sociologists that try to sort of make their field appear scientific because we believe that's going to give them more credibility. And that's just complete and utter nonsense, because you don't have to be a science to be a valid field. You know, like I said, sociology is important. It is. I mean, think about it. Without sociology, how would you really be able to determine, like, okay, how many people in society are homeless? How many people in society, have drug issues? How many people in society, um, you know, uh, end up in poverty, let's say, and all of that stuff? Sociology is great when you want to get a gauge on society. That's what sociology is good for. You know, sociologists do great work when they do census data, basically collect data to basically set up, tables of information from which, policies can be made. So sociology can be a real good, force for good, and it's really useful, and I would say even necessary in society, in order for, politicians, let's say, to be able to come up with good policies. But the problem with sociology is you can't actually do an experiment. You know, that's the biggest problem with sociology. And then people, one thing that people usually say to me when I make that statement is, well, what about surveys? Blah blah blah. Well, what about them? A survey is not an experiment; it's an evaluation. You know, and if you conflate that with an experiment, then I suggest you look up what the fucking experiment is. See, the thing about a natural science is we can set up controlled environments. You know, like when I'm in my lab and I'm experimenting with chemicals, that's a controlled environment. I can, to the highest degree possible, exclude external, things that might influence the outcome. You know, it can be a very sterile environment, if you will. Same thing with biology. You can do controlled experiments in biology for the most part. Physics, you can do controlled, experiments in controlled environments. You can't do that in sociology. The best thing you can do in sociology is, and again, I'm not saying that it's not valid. Quite the opposite. It's still valid. It's just what you can do in sociology is you can look at what other nations have done, and you can sort of ascertain some kind of, data from that, as sort of try and learn from that, and maybe make some kind of predictive model and whatever from that. But you have to sort of wait for things to happen in sociology, because you can't do an experiment on an entire society. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the fundamental flaws of sociology, and why it's not an actual science, because you can't do experiments in a controlled environment. In fact, I find it funny how a lot of sociologists are sort of self-contradictory when they say that, on one hand, they say that, oh, well, I mean, we deal with a science too. Sociology is the science of societies and how they work and change and whatever. And at the same time, whenever you question, their results, and how they, might clash with other results that other sociologists have, they usually, bring up like the getaway line of, basically, well, culture influences, culture influences this and that. Well, I mean, okay, so you just admitted then that you just admitted that you can't have a control experiment, because culture influences to a huge degree your results, and it's going to be different from society to society. Yeah. So you have so many confounding factors that you can't possibly, account for all of them. Societies are really complicated, and I mean, kudos to sociologists that actually do what they're supposed to, which is, to have a gauge on society and basically take measurements in society. But that's really all you can do. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's valid, as it really is, but that's all you can do, and that's why it's not a science. Yeah. It can still be, a highly valid academic field, and there are plenty of sociologists that know their limitations and, basically stick to what they're good at, and kudos to those people. But there are also those who try to sort of inflate, the veneer of sociology by simply pretending that it's a science, and that's a fatal flaw, in my opinion. And So basically, you have a problem where science is being attacked by postmodernists who basically question the very fundamental procedures of scientific inquiry. And they do so by trying to conflate it with the motivations of scientists. And that is just fundamentally dishonest. And that is the problem I have with Kuhn in particular. And that's why Popper, I think, is very important. You know, Karl Popper, who came up with these ideas of falsification. Because in science, and this is like, I've actually had arguments with social scientists or sociologists, rather, who argue with me regarding the nature of science, and they don't even get that right. Like some of them think that scientists aim to prove things, and that's just not how it works. In order for something to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. You know, when we do an experiment, we don't aim to prove anything. We aim to try and disprove something. And if you fail to disprove a hypothesis over and over and over again, let's say, then it becomes stronger by default. But you're not actually proving it. You're just, you know, doing your damnedest to disprove it. And this merciless, you know, no fucks given approach to trying to utterly obliterate ideas in science is what weeds out the weak ideas, and it preserves the strong ideas. And, you know, eventually, if a hypothesis manages to, you know, withstand the most brutal of assaults, then it may be elevated to a theory, you know. Keep in mind, though, that theory may one day be disproven, however. So, but a theory is the highest status that any idea can have. It means that it has withstood all kinds of attempts to disprove it. And so far, we've just not been able to. So it's by default a very strong position. However, it's possible that it might give some leeway in the future when we discover more things, and it could still be disproven one day. So it's important to keep in mind. But that's something that a lot of sociologists don't even seem to understand, I've noticed.
Yes,
like
I agree.
You know, and I think one of the problems is that they, like you said, because they use deductive reasoning a lot, they sort of fool themselves in many ways into thinking that they're coming to some kind of rational conclusion when actually they're just following confirmation bias. I think a very good example.
Reasoning, you mean, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Inductive reasoning.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. But yeah, so I think you're absolutely correct there, and I think a very good example of this is, and look, I'm sorry if I'm going to piss off any feminist in the audience here who is listening, but a very good example of this is patriarchy hypothesis. And I refuse to say patriarchy theory because it's not a theory. It's merely a hypothesis, and that's really all it can be. And the biggest problem with it is that it's essentially unfalsifiable. You know, you have these feminists who say that, men rule everything, and you know it's a man's world. Women are kept down. And you know, women are paid less and whatever. Well, you debunk the wage gap and show that no, actually, the reason that there's a disparity in earnings is because men go into these fields and women go into those fields, and those fields that women go into, they require less education, usually have less dangerous work environments. That means that, you know, yeah, of course you're not going to be paid as much as a fucking, you know, builder if you're like a daycare worker and whatever. But then they shift the goalpost and say that, but the reason they go into those fields is because, you know, they're sort of conditioned into it, blah, blah, blah. So you can't really falsify it because they're always shifting the goalpost, you know, and the definition of patriarchy is never clearly defined enough where you can definitively say that, okay, well, this is utterly destroyed now. Like you have no leg to stand on. And that's a huge problem with sociology just in general. And I think a lot of sociologists just don't understand how science actually operates. And I think Kuhn, who was, you know, I think he was more of a historical analyst. He was not a scientist. You're right. I think that's sort of the mindset that he has. But yeah. Anyways, so let's skip forward now in time and let's talk about the current problems that sort of basically the problem with wokeness. I know that you had a discussion with Lawrence Krauss about it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it was. I listened to it. It was very educational, and yeah, Lawrence Krauss. He's one of those people who, I mean, me and him would not agree on everything regarding politics, but what I do respect about him is the fact that um, he is one of those academics who genuinely want to have a real exchange of ideas. And he's not afraid to have some conflict in the process. In fact, conflict is one of the driving forces of, innovation regarding forging new ideas. And postmodernists sort of paved the way for modern wokeness when they started to sort of openly question and dismantling the procedures of science and making, the public as well as many other academics openly disregard the value and robustness and integrity of the scientific process. And you have so many stories these days, and it's quite scary actually. Like, I believe it was Yale University that started to openly discriminate against Asians, if I believe.
It was Yale and
Because
Harvard, I believe, right?
yeah, Yale and Harvard. And I mean, this is open, clear-cut discrimination. Like, I believe it has to be illegal. Like, there's no way that can be illegal, you know? But it the fact that you have this board and they're like openly doing this. And why exactly? Well, because these Asians, they're getting too good grades. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you're literally disincentivizing the whole point of university. Like, don't you want your students to do well? Like, you're disincentivizing students to do well in their studies. Like, this is literally antithetical to the whole purpose of being an institution of learning,
Yeah, that's one of the problems with equity, the concept of equity. And even then, it's not even effective because you look at the dropout rates from, let's say, black people who were disproportionately being admitted into law school. They're like failing, the dropout rates is overwhelming because they're not qualified. So even from their own perspective, it's not even effective. Like you're making the problem worse. If the end goal is to have more black people as lawyers, you're making it worse. So even using their own rules, it's not effective.
Yeah, and I remember, like I'm getting some flashbacks now to like 2014, 2015, 2016 when, talking about these purple-haired SJWs on college campuses was all the rage. And I mean, in hindsight, there are definitely worse things to talk about that are going on right now in our contemporary society. But that being said, it's still a real issue when you have these youths who are supposed to be the next generation of critical inquiry and open discussion in the marketplace of ideas, how they themselves start to sort of resent the exchange of ideas, and instead of engaging with these ideas that they perceive to be bad and sort of challenging them, they want to sort of go around these ideas and not have to bother with them at all, which is a very dangerous phenomena. And I mean, look, let me put it this way: when Trump's administration, basically, I believe they were the ones who signed into law that as in a government employee, like you weren't allowed to criticize Israel, like there was a big hullabaloo around that. That is a clear violation of the First Amendment, and that takes precedence when it comes to discussions about this. But that is a top-down assault on free expression and freedom of speech, and that's huge. Same thing with like the persecution of Assange and Edward Snowden, as well as Chelsea Manning. But then you also have from bottom up assault on freedom of speech, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what you see in college campuses. And basically what you're having is you're having youths who, I mean, let's face it, you and I have been, I mean, what age are you in?
Oh, how old am I?
Yeah,
24.
24. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, you remember what it was like when you were like 19, 20. I remember what it was like to be 19 and 20. And like, you think you have like a grasp on life at that point, and you have like all these ambitious ideas, and you want to change the world and whatever. But then trust me, when you, get a decade older, like you realize I didn't know shit.
Hmm.
Like I didn't know shit. Like, look, I've always been very mature for my age, and I definitely wasn't like ignorant when I was like 20 or whatever. I definitely was not. In hindsight, I was actually, compared to most people my age, I was like very, you know, uh, educated and knowledgeable, and actually had a lot of experience with life already at that point when it comes to certain jobs I had and educations or whatever. But still, compared to today, like, no, I didn't know nearly as much as I do now. And I can only imagine how much I'm going to know about life in another 10 years,
Yeah.
or 15 or 20. So the thing is, when you're in that age, you're actually way more impressionable than you think. And so let's say that you're walking on this college campus. Again, you're just fresh out of high school, and you're like, damn, I'm going to make something out of myself. I'm gonna study hard, and I'm gonna learn about how the world works, and then I'm gonna join the workforce, and I'm gonna do my thing. Well, let's say that you have a charismatic professor, and you're like, I could study physics, let's say, but it might be boring. So you know what, I'm gonna give sociology a chance here. Okay, well, let's say that let's say that you're an individual who uh, doesn't belong to the so-called, Caucasian population. Let's say that you're a black student, or maybe a Latino student, or whatever the hell you want to classify yourself as.
Latinx.
Yeah. Oh my God, it's cancer. But the thing is, let's say that you're one of those demographics, or let's say that you're female, and you have a very charismatic professor. Let's say that you're female and you take women's studies, and you learn about, like, some real grievances and real injustices throughout history regarding maybe your demographic. But then you also have in there, weaved in the personal biases and opinions of the charismatic teacher. And basically these teachers, whether they're aware of it or not, they're just telling you essentially what you want to hear, because, I mean, let's face it, life is so much simpler if you believe that there's a boogeyman working against you. You know, life is so much simpler and makes more sense if you feel like you're the protagonist of a story, especially when you're in that impressionable age. I mean, it's no secret, like, today's generation wants to believe that they are the ones who can make a difference, whatever that difference is. Everybody today wants to be a protagonist. No one wants to accept the fact that, no, most likely you're just another cog in a machine. you know no, you have to be special. Everybody has to be a fucking special snowflake these days. I see it myself. I work part-time as a teacher. I can't tell you how many times I've asked my students what they want to do for a living, and, like, so many of them say that, oh, I want to be a YouTuber, I want to be an influencer, I want to do this and that. And I'm like, okay, well, um why do you think you're reading, chemistry? Why do you think you're learning about physics? What do you think you're learning about all these things in school? I don't know. Because, like, you need to know how to think, dummy. Like, you need experience. Who knows? Maybe you think that way now, but maybe if you try these things, you're not going to think that anymore. Besides, you do realize that the chance that you're going to break through in any of those things, like, it's really slim. But no, that realism goes out the door. But my point is, everybody wants to be a fucking protagonist these days. No one wants to accept the fact that most likely they're just a basic bitch. You know, I mean, it's true, isn't it? Like, it's, no one wants to accept these days. You're not that special. Okay. You're just a regular person, most likely. There's probably nothing really special about you. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. Like it just means that you're normal, okay? Very few individuals in history have become something great, okay? And let's face it, many of those people became great because they were lucky, you know? Talent plays into it, like, being brilliant plays into it, but you also have so many cases in history of geniuses not being discovered until after their death too, you know? So a lot of it is really dependent on luck, like take Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, sure, he had a bit of a career in Italy during his time, as a learned scholar and whatever. He did have some, lucrative contracts with people who, employed his services and whatever. But it wasn't until his, after his death that his true brilliance was really discovered by the world. Same thing with many other, you know, great thinkers of history and whatnot. Um, Nikola Tesla as well. He wasn't really recognized for his brilliance regarding, his discoveries about electricity until after his death. He died broke and destitute. So, like, even if you were one of those people who had that little extra, chances are it's not going to happen. I'm sorry, I hate to be crass about it, but that's just how it is. Now, if you get a good education, however, you still have something to fall back on. Now, I realize that if I decide to go into research in chemistry, most likely I'm not going to be one of those people who make a breakthrough and get a Nobel Prize. But you know what? Because I have my education and because I have a good job, I'm still going to end up well in life. And I'm still going to contribute to the general knowledge in my field if I decide to go into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That to me is reward enough to know that I've done my part. But no, everybody needs to feel special, and just doing your fucking fair share of something that's not good enough anymore. No, everybody needs to get a fucking participation trophy these days. But the point is, so you know what I'm talking about when I say that we've all been in that age where we've been very impressionable and we're very open to the idea that there's something special about us,
Mm-hmm.
And even I had some of that when I was, back when I was 20. Again, not to the same extent as other people my age, I don't think, but still, even I had that, and I think it's just a natural part of life at that age. I think it can also be a bit of a force for good, because if you have something that's genuinely worthwhile getting behind, like if you're protesting an unjust war and whatever, or if you're protesting for free speech, like you saw in the 60s and 70s on college campuses, those are worthwhile efforts. And I'm not saying that youth shouldn't get involved in movements or whatever to cause change, because no, at that point in your life, you don't have the same obligations as adults do. Adults usually have kids and families and incomes to think about. They usually don't have time or energy to spend, trying to cause positive change in society in the same manner. So students should be involved, I think, in stuff that they actually believe in. But what I'm saying is, be critical of what you're actually getting involved in, and just realize that you're part of a movement, a system. You're not the star, and you shouldn't do it for your own selfish indulgence in, virtue signaling and feeling like a good person. You should do it because you actually care about, the cause. And so anyway, so let's say that you have a very charismatic teacher who tells you that, hey, at the end of the day, it's not about you, you know, not doing what you were supposed to. You didn't actually fail. The system failed you, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And, it becomes so much simpler, doesn't it? Life, when you have a mentality. And look, I'm not saying that things like economic class doesn't play a part. I definitely agree with that. I do support universal education, even at the university level, because that would actually increase merit, and it would allow students who are poor to actually get the same education as someone who's rich. It would sort of equalize the playing field. Universal education is a very good thing. But at the end of the day, guess what, Bob? It's you who have to take the time to read your books. It's you who have to take time to listen to lectures. It's you who have to take time to, practice the problems. It all falls on you, you know. If you live in a system that allows you the same opportunity as anyone else, you literally have no excuse. So, that's really something that really bothers me today. And so a lot of these people, they use the gullibility and the need for recognition of the youths. They use that to sort of indoctrinate these youths into believing in power structures and whatever, when in reality it's not that simple, you know. I remember, have you seen this video of this South African student? She's talking about witchcraft.
Oh,
You know,
Cape Town.
she,
Yes.
yeah, she's talking about witchcraft, and I mean, thankfully, her fellow students sort of laugh at her, which is exactly what she fucking deserves, to be honest. No, I mean, look, some people may be like, oh, but laughing at her is a bit hard, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's ridiculous. She deserves to be laughed at. I don't give a fuck. You suggest that shit in my fucking classroom, I'm gonna laugh. I'm gonna laugh at your. I'm gonna laugh in your fucking face. I am. I'm merciless when it comes to stuff like that. If you want to genuinely criticize something on valid basis, on a valid basis, that's one thing. But when you literally believe that Sabrina the Teenage Witch is a documentary, I mean, I have no respect for you. And she obviously doesn't deserve to be in those hallowed halls of education if she wants to engage in, fucking adult fantasies about magic. But she literally talks about witchcraft, and she argues that no, I mean, the reason that witchcraft is not more known or accepted is because of colonialism or whatever. Like the white man has like imperialized science and have sort of taken away the way of knowing things of the African bush religion and whatever. And I look at that and I go, like, how does this even happen? This is, like, this is the 21st century. We are surrounded by the wonders of technology. I look to my right and I see my 4K television. I look to my left and I see my electric guitar. I look right in front of me, I see the screen, and all of these things that give my life a higher living standard. It's all thanks to the procedural acquiring of knowledge by the scientific method. What some witch doctor in Congo has done, I don't know, sacrificing a chicken, that has nothing to do with it. He can sacrifice a chicken all he wants. That's not going to make any kind of material improvement in anyone's life. Mm-hmm. And so I don't understand, like, how does, you know what I mean? Like, it's one of those situations where it's so bizarre that it sort of makes you question reality itself a little bit. It's almost like, why doesn't like who taught her this? How come this academic who taught her this? How come that they, like, how do they still have a job? Do you know what I mean? Like, how does this happen? It's I just don't get it. Same thing with back in 2015, where you had this this professor in media who was supposed to teach students about things like, oh, I don't know, the First Amendment, who said that a journalist was not allowed to film them, in an open public space, by the way, and she called a muscle to remove that journalist. And I don't know if you remember that case, but she later was investigated by the university due to public pressure, I think, and she was eventually found to be, guilty of trying to instigate like an assault on this person. And the weird thing was, you saw these students who tried to sort of defend her, and they were talking about like, oh, but she knows what freedom of speech means and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, hey, students, all you have to do is, like, you can literally read the Constitution. Like, you can look it up online. You can read what the First Amendment is. But none of them did so. Like, it's so obvious. None of these students have actually read the Constitution, because reading the very first, amendment, it's completely contradictory to what their teacher has taught them. But yet they take the word of the teacher above the objectively, sound wording and phrasing of the actual Constitution. I'm sorry, but the Constitution takes precedence over your teacher. Your teacher is human. Your teacher is fallible. We can read with our own eyes what it actually says in the Constitution. She doesn't understand free speech better than the Constitution. Okay, I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. The Constitution is literally the basis of free speech in the U.S. And I'm just wondering, do you have one example you want to bring up about how wokeness is sort of endangering scientific procedure?
Well, the procedure itself, I mean, there was a recent conversation about whether or not 2 plus 2 can equal 5, and granted, a lot of the people were just making that argument to show that like the way math works, and whether or not basically a lot of people just boiled it down to the debate over whether or not math is discovered or invented.
Basically, the fundamental conflict between, I think it was Plato and was it Socrates? Can't remember now.
Yeah,
Because Plato, I believe, Plato apparently, if I remember correctly, believed that a perfect circle exists like in another dimension, and we just sort of attain the knowledge of a perfect circle from the fact that there is a perfect circle out there somewhere. While Socrates, I believe it was Socrates, believed rather that no, it's a figment of our mind, But anyway, go on.
Yeah, but so a lot of people were really just using this 2 plus 2 equals 5 argument to bring that argument into light, which I think, sure, fine. But there were a significant number of people out there who were actually using this as a way to justify different forms of knowledge, in which, they basically came across as the rationalists, in which they say that knowledge that you get from things like religion or any other form of knowledge acquisition is just as valid as science. Science is nothing more than just another avenue of knowledge. And there were people who said this with a straight face, and scientists were saying this. These are the people who are teaching at some of the most prestigious universities out there. Now that's a problem, because as far as I was under the impression that arguing for science, arguing for evidence-based thinking, arguing for logical coherency was something that we were usually just fighting back against creationists with. That's what I thought. That's when I thought the argument was going to end. I never expected the argument to come back in 2015 was when I first started noticing. I never expected us to start arguing now against people who are scientists themselves. But again, these aren't scientific claims that they're making, so it's not like they have some level of expertise that we don't, and we're just arguing against the experts. No, they're not. They're not even using science to come to these conclusions. In fact, they're arguing against it. And this is becoming more and more prominent. Lawrence Krauss, he wrote an article, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, where he said that he recognized this problem, that there were just a few, crazies out there that believed in this deconstructivist attitude towards science, but it was really isolated to the humanities. And so they didn't do anything about it. No one really fought back. But because no one fought back, now it's pestilentially spreading into STEM, and it's becoming more and more popular. And so this is what I always say to people who say things like, yeah, sure, this crazy deconstructivist attitude is insane, but it's just a few bad apples, and what we really need to be focused on is the right. This rise of right-wing populism that's spreading across Western Europe and the United States now at this point. But what I say to these people is I say, yes, quantitatively speaking, it is more dangerous. But the problem is that how much longer do we have to continue to say that this thing isn't that big of a problem? We said that back then, and it got worse. If we say that now, it's going to get worse. We need to have some people fighting against this stuff before it gets disastrously worse than it already is.
That actually reminds me of what I wanted to talk about, because I went on a little bit of a tangent before and I sort of forgot like the red thread here. But one thing that definitely we need to talk about here right now is has absolutely to do with this. It's how, for instance, and I know you're friends with, what's his name? Isn't he a writer for Colette?
Colin Wright, James Lindsay.
He's a biologist.
Colin Wright, the evolutionary biologist.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So because I've read some of his articles, and so far it seems to be pretty much on point and good at whatever. And so as far as I've understood, the guy is actually like left wing, or at least center left, and he's not all some kind of, you know, right wing fucking lunatic as he's often described to be. But the thing is, like, I've read his articles or whatever, and it's sort of like a breath of fresh air, to be honest, because I've dealt with some of his nonsense myself. And like, even when it comes to like an actual natural science like biology, it's starting to sort of infect that area, especially when we start to talk about, you know, sex, you know, the difference between, you know, male and female, and how, you know, you sort of try to bring in ideas of gender identity and whatever into it. And let me just say this: whatever the fuck you identify as, I do not give a fuck. I do not give a flying fuck if you're a man and you identify as a woman, or a woman identifies as a man. You want to change your legal gender and whatever to what you feel comfortable with, and you want to undergo hormone treatment and even, you know, genital corrective surgery and whatever, and live the rest of your life as the gender you identify with, I say go ahead. I wish you good luck in life. I realize that being transgender must be a fucking hell, and if you can do something to deal with that dysphoria and live a healthy, fulfilling life, I wish you all the best of life. I really do. And also personally, you know, as long as you're not being a dick or a cunt, you know, if you want me to use pronouns that you feel comfortable with, I will. You know, like I'm not a fucking asshole when it comes to this. I'm not unreasonable. However, what I do tell you is, don't fucking police language, and don't fucking bring your ideas of identity into a laboratory where we deal with actual, you know, biological facts. Okay. Chromosomes don't give a fuck about how you identify. Okay. Now, transgenderism is real. It really is. Okay. But we are starting to understand the actual fundamental mechanisms behind it. You know, like, for instance, one thing we've noticed is that men who want to transition into women tend to have more white brain matter than what you usually find in male brains, you know? And usually men have far more gray matter than white brain matter. And usually women have more white brain matter than, you know, gray brain matter. And there's a very, 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 very strong correlation between the amount of, you know, white brain matter you have and whether you identify as female or not. So, I mean, that alone is kind of a big discovery, actually, because it shows us that, yeah, that alone can be a good indication to sort of tell if you're probably going to be transgender or not. But here's the thing: your chromosomes don't lie, okay? If you have a Y chromosome, you're male. Why? Because the Y chromosome is dominant. I'm sorry, I didn't make the rules, okay? It is what it is. Now, whether you decide to call, you know, an individual with a Y chromosome male or not, okay, that has absolutely no bearing upon the biochemical mechanisms of the chromosomes. You know, the information that's, you know, stored in the histone, you know, it's there. It does what it does, and no amount of word salad is ever going to change that. You know, and just because you have some individuals where they have an uneven number of sex chromosomes or different variations of them, or lacking one maybe, it doesn't mean that they're a different gender or sex. You know, it means that they have basically a mutation that, you know, actually is not desirable at all, and not something that should be normalized. Usually these come with some pretty hefty consequences, like, you know, females who are born with only one X chromosome, they tend to have problems with their neck and whatever. Like, it's actually not something that's like should be glamorized and normalized. It's actually a pretty horrific thing to go through, to know that you have something wrong on a genetic level with you. And you know, I get it. I do. You know, people who are transgender, for instance, a lot of them want to be recognized and seen as normal and whatever. But, you know, if you want us to treat you like normal people, then why are you complaining when we do just that? And we, you know, when we recognize your genetic code, you know, again, what you feel like is one thing, And if you're happy, identifying with the other gender, and you want people to treat you like you are part of the other gender, again, no problem. It's just you have to recognize genetic reality. If you're a man and you transition into a woman, you will never genetically be female.
Mm-hmm.
You can legally and psychologically and hormonally become female, but you can't actually genetically become female. That is fundamentally the issue at hand. And so, what Colin, what he writes about in his articles, and I think he does a very good job, is he talks about how you're taking these disorders, and that's really what they are, and you're perverting, the definition of them, as well as glamorizing almost the the condition that they are, and you're trying to mold it into, a viable way of being on par with, just choosing a type of lifestyle, let's say. That's not how it works. And honestly, I think the vast majority of people who are born with these types of, disorders, I think they find that incredibly offensive and would honestly want to slap the fuck out of people who do this sort of thing, because it's not glamorous. It's not something that should be normalized. It's actually quite horrendous in many cases, and it's gone so far now where I think it's funny because we talked a little bit about before about, let's say that you're a woman and you're, joining college and you go into a women's studies, course, let's say, and, you do so because you want to help, other women across the world and whatever your motivations are. I find it really funny how today you have so many of these same individuals who for decades now have gone on about how you need to support women and whatever, basically throwing women under the bus for, gender ideology,
Right.
such as, when it comes to, athleticism, sports. And one thing I just cannot understand is you have so many of these stories where these very same individuals are completely silent. And not only that, but actually defending what's going on right now, where you have these, I mean, you've seen some of these stories, I'm sure. Like, you have guys who are obviously guys, like they haven't even bothered, obviously, to start taking female hormones and whatever. In many cases, they're still buff as hell, and they're legally allowed, apparently, to compete against biological girls and women. And I just, I'm sorry, like you're not even consistent here with your own ideology here. Like, if you're gonna push your ideology onto your students, can you at least be consistent? But you're not, because all that you've worked for all these decades about, patriarchal theory, or hypothesis rather, and how, women are subjugated and oppressed, and how you need to support women, international sisterhood, yada yada yada. You're willing to throw all of that under the bus just so you won't be called a transphobe.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, since when did dudes start to be placed higher in the progressive stack, according to you, than women that you claim to want to help just because they identify as women? Like, it doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like, even according to their own standards, like, it shouldn't make sense.
Yeah, what you can tell very obviously about many of these arguments is that they're very based in activism rather than science. So, so here's the thing with like this whole argument of, how do we classify sex? Do we classify it by gamete type, by chromosome, by primary characteristics versus secondary characteristics? It's more of a definitional game, just, Colin Wright makes the argument that the way we should define sex is more by gamete type than by chromosomes or by your gonads. It's just so much easier, and it really just gets to the heart of what it is that we're talking about. And it's just a definition game at that point. But what I've noticed is that when I read books like the Spectrum of Sex or the Gender Mosaic, these very, wokish gender-based books or sex-based books, what I notice is that half of these books, like a good 50%, minimum 40% of this book, is talking about the historical injustices of, of discrimination, sex-based or gender-based discrimination. It's making a normative argument. And I'm thinking to myself, this is supposed to be a work of academic honesty. This is a scholastic book. Why are you talking
You're
about
not
this
supposed to make a value judgment. You're supposed to, ascertain the observations and the data and make an informed analysis based upon them. You're not supposed to come into this with an already established bias, trying to prove something.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine Einstein's book on relativity talking about the persecution of the Jews and why the fact that there are so many Jewish Nobel Prize winners is a good thing because of historical injustices? Like, sure, you can talk about that. That's a totally valid argument that you'd be making, but that has nothing to do with the theory of relativity. Why are you including that in here?
Oh yeah, and on the flip side, that was the same problem with some of the physicists that were pushed by the Nazis at the same time, attacking relativity just because a Jew came up with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's actually something that a lot of people aren't taught about scientific history, but it's actually kind of funny how you have this one physicist especially, can't remember his name now, but he was pushed by the Nazi Party really hard, and basically all the arguments he made in his public speeches against relativity, he made like the dumbest fucking childish arguments you can imagine, like, oh well, if general relativity is true, I mean, just imagine you walk a little bit faster than that man in the background, your clock is going to tick slower. It seems kind of ridiculous to me. Jews, am I right? Jewish relativism. Hey, everybody, remember how the Jews crashed the economy and made us lose the First World War? I'm just saying, there's a connection here between the watch and breaking down common sense, folks. Whatever. It was like really fucking stupid. But it's the same thing there. Like, yeah, the fact that Jews have been oppressed and Einstein was a Jew, like that has nothing to do with his, discoveries and his models regarding special and general relativity. Like that has absolutely nothing to do with it. And the point I'm making is, when it comes to whatever you identify with, that's a social issue. Okay, that's a social issue, and that can actually be relevant for something like sociology. But the problem is the conflation between the social and the empirical. You want to talk about that shit, can you at least keep it contained in sociology? Because like that's where it actually has some kind of relevance, I think. But like as soon as it starts to leak out into actual empirical inquiries and perverting what empiricism is supposed to be, you're not just doing a disservice to those fields, you're also doing a disservice to sociology, because you're making all of it seem like a clown show. And again, like I told you, not all of sociology is a clown show. A lot of it is today, but there's also like some really golden nuggets, in sociology. Like sociology can be a real good force for good, as long as it knows what it's supposed to do, as well as the fact that you're actually trivializing and making it harder for the public to just accept the people that you claim to sort of represent. I mean, think about it. If you try to use gender ideology to defend basically burly men competing against girls in wrestling or deadlifting or whatever, I mean, think about it. Like, do you think that's going to help, or rather just obstruct any attempt of you to sort of try and normalize and integrate transsexuals into society? I mean, like, which one do you think is going to happen? Because I can tell you, the average person looking at that is going to be, well, this is fucking insane. Like my daughter thought that she was going to have like a fair fight here, in wrestling, but no, she had to like wrestle this guy, and he pretty much just fucking sumo blasted her, like pow, like she was nothing. And if we say anything about it, we're apparently bigots, and the board apparently thinks this is okay. I mean, so do you think that father and that daughter, do you think they're going to be more or less inclined to be more respectful and accepting of transsexuals after that?
Yeah, I mean, they probably wouldn't be, right?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, if they go by their personal experience, they would have a good reason not to be, because I mean, yeah. So this is what I'm saying. It's like these people, like not only are their fundamental thesis erroneous, not only are they doing themselves and other fields a disservice by perverting like the actual empirical process of scientific inquiry, but they're actually not even helping demographics that they claim to help. Like, no, you're actually making things go backwards. Like, I think there was this opinion poll that was done maybe a year or so ago. And apparently the public's opinion on homosexuals in general has actually gone down a little bit since the passing of the what was it called in 2008? Proposition 8, yeah. I think it was. Yeah. So when Proposition 8 passed, like you had like this landmark in statistics where, the vast majority of Americans were apparently, if I remember correctly, okay with homosexuals, just in general, and most people agreed, yeah, homosexuals should have the right to marry. But apparently like a year or so ago, if I remember correctly, there was this opinion poll that was done where apparently the public opinion had actually gone down a little bit. And, you would expect it to be the opposite. You would expect it to be even more positive these days, and look, I'm not going to claim that I have knowledge that I simply do not have. There could be many reasons why this opinion had gone down, if I remember correctly. But I do believe that one of the reasons is because gender ideology, as well as all other types of, ideologies regarding these demographics, is being pushed down people's throats, essentially, And I think you're actually doing a huge disservice for society in general, as well as these demographics, when you claim to sort of represent them, but you're actually engaging in things that just materially, as well as, materially make things worse for people in general, but also opens up actual discrimination against people because of their, demographic attributes, which isn't that what you're supposed to be against in the first place? You're supposed to apparently want to remove any hindrance for people, so there's a more even playing field, but you're literally disadvantaging an entire gender by allowing these people to compete against them. So you're literally doing the opposite of what you claim to do, and you're doing it for a way smaller minority than the demographic that you originally intended to like help. So none of this shit makes any sense, man. And it's really fucking depressing when I look at it. And I think Lawrence Krauss is definitely someone that people should sort of, listen to when it comes to this stuff. Same thing with climate change, because look, I've made numerous videos debunking climate denialists, people who deny that climate change is real and that humans are speeding up the process. And at the same time, though, I've also taken a lot of heat because I also make videos, basically exposing the opposite that I call climate hysterics. So I've done a video on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where I basically just exposed how she literally knows nothing about like how weather works. She made this stupid argument that, tornadoes are becoming more common in Washington, D.C., and they're going to grow in size and strength. And like, she also made like another statement like, we're all going to fucking die in 12 years if we don't do something about climate change. And, you have so many of her fucking fanboys who fucking defend her, who went down my throat and were like, but you misunderstand. Like, she's just trying to make people more aware of the problem. Blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I mean, look, even if that's her intention, she's actually doing this whole thing a fucking disservice, because that's only going to turn people off, because most people realize that, well, that can't be true, or at least they're going to assume that it just doesn't sound logical,
Yeah.
And she's actually not doing the scientists justice either, because you've had so many academics who've gone after her as well, not just me, but actual climatologists who say that, no, the world is not going to end in 12 years. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Same thing with Al Gore, and no one should take Al Gore seriously. So you have a huge problem with science being under attack, both from lobbyists and think tanks, from the oil industry, who sort of take certain scientists under their wing and fund their research, and in turn they get like scientific papers that are favorable to the idea that, hey, maybe climate change is not that serious. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, for sure.
Like how Exxon funds certain scientists to publish papers, and I don't think it's a coincidence that those papers tend to be, when they're funded by these oil companies and gas companies and coal companies, I don't think it's a coincidence that they tend to be more neutral or even more in the denialist camp of climate change when they're pushed. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. It's very odd, isn't it, how all of those papers tend to be way less conclusive than other independently funded papers. And so you have one attack on science in that sense, and then you have another attack on science where they instead exaggerate the problem. And let me just say this: climate change is a real issue. It really is, and we need to do something about it. But it's not going to lead to an apocalypse. But that's also wrong. I think Lawrence Krauss actually even said this when he was talking to you about how climate change, it's going to lead to a lot of death and misery, but it's not going to overnight cause a fucking apocalypse. Besides, even in the worst case scenario of climate change, like, there are ways we can mitigate the damages. Like, we can build dams, we can improve infrastructure to deal with it. We can sort of weather the storm, like, quite literally by building better residences and whatever. There are ways to deal with it, and it's going to be an extended period of hundreds of years if this is going to happen. It's not going to be overnight, which is another problem with people like Greta and AOC. They don't seem to understand. And so there's another example, I think, of how, like, the science of it is sort of indirectly under attack, both by people who want to undermine the actual scientific validity of it, and people who want to overreach and indirectly eliminate the scientific credibility of it. It kind of reminds me of the last essay I did. I don't know if you saw that one, but I did an essay about the tobacco industry and how it was under siege. How it attacked the medical community in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. It was called, I think it was Big Tobacco versus Medical Science, How Science is Vulnerable. And, if there's one video that I suggest that people watch of mine, it's that one, because I think I do a pretty good job of doing a deep dive into how science is vulnerable, or rather the image of science, if you will.
Yeah.
And so what the tobacco companies did was that they funded research and actually created their own publications and made them sound like really professional sounding. And then they published research that was not necessarily denying the results of actual medical scientists regarding the dangers of smoking, but rather published results that were convoluting, basically made people question whether it was true or not. It's very much similar to what you see today with the oil and gas and coal companies regarding the research they fund regarding climate change, because most of them don't actually deny climate change, but they try to sort of make you question, okay, well, is this actually happening? Or, is it really that serious? Blah, 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 So, but yeah, there is a big problem with an assault on science just in general these days. And it's, it was sort of easier a couple of decades ago, because then you only had like one type of assault or maybe two going on, but now you have so many of them at the same time. And I am actually a little bit worried about, like, the implications that this is going to have on not science itself, but on the institutions of science. Like, because the way universities are responding to this, and I think this is really the biggest danger of all, is that they're actually entertaining a lot of this nonsense. Like, you notice how many of the scientists aren't actually the ones who are entertaining it, but like, they're usually vocal about like their resistance to it. But what's happening is, like, the faculty who oversee the scientists of the universities, they are usually the ones who cave in and, basically offer like racial sensitivity training, offer, quotas, offer, basically, yeah, such as, Evergreen College, for instance. What's his name? Was it Brian? Or is it? It ends with Stein, I believe.
Brett Weinstein.
Yeah, exactly. But Brett Weinstein, and I like the guy. I really do. I think he can be a bit too soft sometimes when he's criticizing certain things, but I think he's just very polite as a person. I think that's just a character
Yeah, I love
thing.
that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, but generally, I enjoy listening to him. I think he needs to call a spade more often than he does. But he does at least talk about these issues, and I think he was a bit courageous when he stood up to his own students as well as the cowardly faculty of his college and
And
how
Dave
they
Rubin,
open.
he's also done with Dave Rubin, so that's good.
Yeah, exactly. And so what he for those of people for the people who don't know, basically what happened was he was one of the teachers in what was it, organic chemistry, I think. And
Evolutionary biology.
sorry, yeah, evolutionary biology. So he was one of the teachers at this college called Evergreen, and this college was like very quote unquote progressive. Although to be honest, I think progressive these days just means that hey, let's just virtue signal about certain things. Like there's no actual progressivism anymore to be found, to be honest. So yeah, let's just virtue signal and let's discriminate against a demographic that's okay to discriminate against because they have institutional power apparently. So anyway, what happened was they literally wanted to have for a day a day where no white students went to class. Basically, no white students were to be seen on college campus, which is obviously discrimination, and it has to be illegal. There's no way for that to actually be legal if they try to enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
And Brett Weinstein, if I remember correctly, he basically was vocal about his resistance to this because he believed that this would actually hurt, race relations, which I agree with. I mean, doing that sort of thing, it's just virtue signaling. Like you're not actually doing anything to materially improve the black students, situation at all. Like how are the studies of a black student supposed to improve by not seeing a white student for a day? It makes absolutely no sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so he basically vocalized his opposition to this. And what happened was like there was a total outcry, total anarchy, like it almost evolved into an actual riot where the students basically held a lot of the faculty hostage, more or less, invaded their fucking offices, protested and whatever. And I remember
there were reports of professors hiding in their cars and students outside with baseball bats.
Exactly.
Very
And
shady.
I remember I saw this video of the principal, I believe, cowering in his fucking chair, this fucking low energy, just cowardly motherfucker just sitting there being like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to offend, no, okay, we'll do something about this, please just leave me alone, instead of being like, okay, you've just broken the law, like you've actually committed crimes now, students. If you're lucky, I might let you leave here voluntarily and I'm not going to call the cops and you're not going to get arrested. But unless you leave, I'm going to fucking call the cops and you're going to get arrested and you're going to have something in your fucking register. That's what they should have done. They should have just told them, okay, look, we're going to give you one last chance. Just go to your dorms and stay there for the rest of the day. Like there's a curfew. And if anyone disobeys, we're going to call in the fucking campus police. And if things get really things get really wild, we'll just call in the regular police, and they will deal with you. That's what they should have said. That's what any sensible person would have been like. It's like, look, it's one thing to respect the beliefs of the students, no matter how correct or incorrect they are or whatever. Everyone has the right to believe whatever the fuck they want to believe. That's important. It's another to engage in vandalism, hostage taking, and undermining the actual purpose upon which the university is founded, which is to teach. Like you're withholding education right now when you're doing this. Like no one can teach anything for several days in a row. I think for an entire week, all classes more or less just shut down. No one was taught anything. Things were destroyed. The whole infrastructure of the campus was turned upside down. They threatened the faculty. And luckily, I don't think anyone was actually physically injured, but still, it could easily have turned into that. And so you have a situation where you have literal fucking children, like literal overgrown children running the asylum, basically taking over and having way too much fucking power over the campus. And you have to imagine, okay, where do they get these ideas from? because this is actually getting scary now. And Evergreen was like one of the worst examples, but it was far from the only one. I remember in 2015 where on Harvard, students basically threatened to riot over Halloween costumes. So basically,
Oh, this was
they
Yale. Yeah, with Nicholas
Yale,
Pistachio.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was Yale, and basically they threatened to basically riot over the fact that they didn't want to allow some students to potentially dress up as Indians or stuff like that because they thought it was like racially insensitive and whatever. I mean, putting aside the fact that no, a lot of Indian tribes actually did dress like that and still do in rituals or whatever. It's not offensive to them. It's just
They
part of
didn't,
their
they didn't want
history.
little girls to dress as Moana. Some of them went so far as to say that. The fucking
Exactly.
yeah.
And it's just really fucking stupid. So because of that, and so I think there was two teachers on Yale who basically in an open letter basically described that, okay, look, we agree with you guys about the problems of race and racism and whatever. So these people weren't even like more like you and me. Like these people were still quite deep in the swamp of these types of harmful and destructive ideologies, but even they were like, okay, this is going way too far. So even they were like, okay, this is like actual like authoritarianism. Like we can't micromanage to that degree. Like, no, you just can't do it. And immediately they got all kinds of fucking pushback by students and other faculty members. And this is a common thread, and this is why this stuff happens in the first place. The faculty throws each other under the bus to appease the masses that have been indoctrinated by these ideological teachers to begin with. I mean, this shit doesn't just happen in a vacuum. This comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you want to be really tedious about it, I think, yeah, you can sort of trace it all the way back to postmodernism, making the first blow and opening up the door to sort of completely disregard the empirical nature and the material, improvement of our lives that is like obvious to anyone who's willing to see it. Like the fruits of science are all around us. Has science been used for bad things? Yeah, sure, because some scientists are bad. Scientists are human beings. It's like I told you before. Like they have motivations to do things or whatever. So if you want to question, scientists, I mean, you can definitely do that, but don't conflate that with the scientific apparatus as a whole.
Yeah.
Like we don't live in the times of Galileo, Newton, or Dalton anymore. Like it's not that open for interpretation anymore. We've set up the peer review system for a reason, as well as having oversights and checking for all kinds of shenanigans regarding tampering of evidence or whatever. Like we are very good these days of discovering these types of things. And experiments are today set up in a way where your personal biases will have essentially no outcome or shouldn't have on the results. And if your results can't be duplicated by independent teams or researchers, then they're thrown out and you're put under suspicion, and that's the way it should be. And that's the way it is. So these people literally have no leg to stand on anymore when they make these types of wild general accusations against the structure of science itself. And so there was a time when you only needed to worry about those people, but now you also need to worry about actual mobilized agencies in society funding, research to try and sort of muddy the waters, as well as internal rot that set in from other branches of academical fields and academics who are willing to throw other academics under the bus because we want to virtue signal and put that higher than the empirical value of their research and the findings and empirical reality, having a higher standing than your feelings.
Yeah. The amount of professors that I've spoken with behind the scenes that all collectively say the same thing, that they'd like to speak out against this thing. They'd like to offer some refutations towards many of the things that their colleagues are saying, but they're concerned that their job will be in jeopardy, or that there'll be some level of public shaming that they don't want to undergo. The amount of professors that have told this to me behind closed doors is really concerning. And it's not even professors telling. It's you can hear these stories all over the place. You can see these these professors anonymously signing letters against this sort of thing. So there's this culture that has been created by these institutions that we're supposed to trust. And it's a shame that this trust is failing. And the reasoning behind, a large reason why the trust is failing, is because people recognize that why is there this aura, this culture now, in which people are going to be publicly shamed or ostracized or canceled if they give an opinion that they don't think so. I mean, Colin Wright, he all he was arguing for was the benign position that sex is binary, that it's not a spectrum. He's not talking about gender, he's talking about sex. And yet he was unable to find a job because of that position. There are these job boards listings for biologists that you can go on, and the things that were on the front page a lot were things saying like, do not hire Colin Wright because he is a transphobe. All because he said no, because he realized, why are there books being published by PhDs that say sex is a spectrum? It's not. And he argued against that, and he couldn't get a job because of that. That's nonsense. Even if Colin is wrong, it doesn't matter. It is a seemingly benign argument that even if it were, even if he did have some malicious intent behind it, which there's no evidence to suggest that he did, especially given how careful he is in how he words his articles and his and other writings. Even if he did have some malicious intent, the fact that we cannot easily conclude that he did have malicious intent, or that we should even be trusting this mechanism that we have, this intuition that we have, that people are just saying things because they have bad intent, it's not enough for us to be able to conclude, okay, therefore, they should no longer be employed, or there should be some level of public shaming. How do you know? You can't know. Not with any enough confidence to say these things. And why are people not even focusing on the argument itself? It goes to what you were saying, beforehand. It's like people are less focused on the policy and whether or not it's good or bad, and they're more focused on the intent of the person itself, as if that's even a valid argument against the actual argument itself.
Oh yeah, it's like I said before, like if you look at James Watson, I mean, look, again, I respect the man as a scientist in the sense that he and Crick were the ones who mapped out what DNA actually looks like, which was a huge discovery. And in 1953, I think they published their paper, and they got their Nobel Prize for it in 1962. I just want to add as well, like, I think there's this controversy regarding this female scientist, Anita, what was her name? Franklin something, maybe. What the fuck was her name? She did like these X-ray. She did this X-ray analysis, and she basically, her discoveries was basically what allowed Watson and Crick to later on make their own discoveries. So she sort of set the groundwork a little bit. And she was actually instrumental in them eventually having their breakthrough. I can't remember her name now, but there's this common myth that she didn't get like the Nobel Prize because she was a woman, while they do because they were men. I just want to tell you people that if you honestly believe that, you've never even bothered to Google it, because she literally died of cancer before she could get her Nobel Prize. So I'm just want to throw that in there, because like I'm sick and tired of that myth. No, it was not because she was a woman.
And they don't give Nobel Prizes posthumously. So like Stephen Hawking, even if everything that he believed is confirmed, he will not get a Nobel Prize.
Exactly. So that's why she never got it, because she died of cancer before she could even receive it. She was actually planned to get one. You can look it up if you don't believe me. But yeah, not only that, but like let's just totally ignore, I guess, that Marie Curie in 1903, which is just 3 years after they started to give out the Nobel Prize, actually received the Nobel Prize. Oh my, that glass ceiling. By the way, look, I'm not saying that women like didn't face problems back then or whatever. That's not at all what I'm saying. But like this idea that there was this insurmountable like wall and whatever in the scientific community. No, give me a fucking break. Marie Curie like got a fucking Nobel Prize just the third year that they started to give them out. She even got a second one in 1909, I believe. So her daughters as well, I think, got Nobel Prizes. So just give it a fucking break. But anyways, so getting back. But what I said before is James Watson, like he's a race realist, and I'm going to go even further. I'm going to say that like he is an actual racist. He really is. I remember I did this response to Alternative Hypothesis, who's a race realist on YouTube. As you know, I've done a lot of videos debunking race realism, because race realists, they a lot of them believe in a lot of pseudoscience, like they really do. Besides race, genetically speaking, doesn't really exist. If you want to talk about race as something that you self-identify with in a social setting, that's perfectly valid. You can use race as a way to divide demographics for census data and whatever, as long as people self-identify with it. It can actually be useful because what people self-identify with regarding race usually coincides with socioeconomic status as well. So in sociology, like you can get away with it as long as people self-identify with it. But like the idea that genetically there is such a thing as race, like I'm sorry, that just doesn't hold any water. We've mapped the human genome. It's this idea definitively died in the 1990s. Ever since the 1990s, like you literally have no genetic leg to stand on whatsoever. And you can't ascertain genotype from phenotypes, like what race realists are trying to do. That's like putting the carriage before the horse. That's not how modern genetic research is done. But anyway, the point is, James Watson, like he is an actual racist. I'm not afraid to fucking say that. He's an actual racist. He literally believes that just because some individuals have more melanin, they're more likely to be promiscuous or even engage in rape or whatever. That's a fucking racist thing to say. But that has absolutely no implication whatsoever on his scientific discoveries. Whether you like the man or not, he did discover with his partner the helix of the DNA of DNA. That is huge. That's a real scientific contribution, and that is what I respect him for. At the same time, the fact that he's a racist doesn't mean that his findings, or lack of findings rather, regarding melanin and promiscuity and whatever, in any way is seen as valid by the scientific community. No, when it comes to that stuff, like he's laughed at by his colleagues because we realize how ridiculous it is. In fact, it was his colleagues that called him out for his, unprofessional conduct. Obviously, they must have a lot of respect for the man because they know his scientific contribution and it should not be scoffed at. But we know how flawed he is as a human being and how he is acting unprofessionally and letting his personal judgment, cloud his scientific conclusions. But I think he's also like excellent evidence of how that doesn't really matter these days in that sense when it comes to the scientific procedure. Again, we have some pretty robust systems that are supposed to prevent your personal judgments from clouding the actual results you achieve in science. Ironically, however, like we've also talked about, is the very same people who usually call into question the results of scientific endeavor because they see discrimination everywhere are usually the ones who actually introduce actual dangers to that rigor and robustness of science by introducing their ideology. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it actually becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because usually these people are the ones who actually are undermining the validity of scientific results because they influence the actual procedure by arguing that, oh, well, this is sexist, this is racist, blah, 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 So, it's a clusterfuck, man. It really is.
The huge clusterfuck. But I think this is probably, we're about to hit we're gonna pass 2 hours. That's pretty great.
Oh yeah, no, sorry about that.
No.
No, but sometimes I don't know. You've done this 3 times with me now, and as you know, like sometimes I find something, I go on a tangent on it, and I've tried to sort of stick to a red thread here. I think that 80% of the time I sort of managed to talk about what I wanted to talk about, but it's just sometimes you end up on a little sidetrack, and you have to sort of talk about that as well.
And no, yeah, this was great, and I'd love, one of the things that we wanted to talk about, but we didn't touch upon, but you can come back a 4th time and we'll talk about.
Oh yeah, fuck, I forgot the string theory and all that stuff.
And all that stuff. So
God damn it, like you should have reminded me actually, because I really wanted to go through that. But anyway, we'll take it next time.
Yeah, for sure. And we probably actually agree on our concern with string theory. So and other similar scientific fields like proton decay. So this was great. Really appreciate you coming on for a 3rd time. I'm glad that you hopefully you have fun being on here and venting towards me, as you like to say.
No, it's always a pleasure, my young Padawan.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. But yeah, man, thank you so much for coming on, and all the links to your stuff will be in the description of the video below, and I hope to see you again in the future.